Okay, for what it's worth, today's date is August 3rd, 2008, and the three of us here are going to talk about fantasy fiction with an emphasis on sword and sorcery fiction. We've had this conversation among ourselves many times, and so now we're going to do it on tape for YouTube. My name is Dave Smith. I've written some of the sword and sorcery material. To my right is Joe Bonadonna, who's also a writer. To my left is Jaquet, who has had the distinction of being the editor, not only, the publisher not only of, editor of Dragon magazine, but the publisher, I believe, later on of amazing stories. So we're going to talk about a number of topics here and get the conversation going. And I guess I would like to start this off by asking Jake some background information on how he got started with Dragon magazine, and specifically how he feels it had an influence on sword and sorcery fiction. My background is in writing very masculine kind of sword and sorcery fiction. We're represented here by fanzines, some of the books that I wrote, Robert Howard's stories in Weird Tales, and then The Next Generation, which was Dragon magazine. So could I ask you to talk about the history of Dragon magazine?
Well, sure. I began work with TSR, the folks that produced the Dungeons & Dragons game, and got on board as one of the earliest employees back in the late 70s. Was there for the heyday of TSR, and then left there in the mid-1980s. And while I was there, I served as starting off assistant editor, later editor, and then finally publisher of Dragon magazine. And along the way, we also acquired the Amazing Science Fiction Stories title and was publisher of that as well. Now, the connection here is, I think, a little peripheral to the type of literature that we're talking about, that Dave and Joe have been authors. But certainly, you can't disassociate the influence that earlier sword and sorcery literature, novels, and short stories had on the development of the Dungeons & Dragons game, and that the outgrowth of that was some of the work that we did at TSR with some of the fiction that we published in Dragon and separately, and where that might have had an influence on the sword and sorcery genre as well. And yeah, I guess I would say offhand that certainly there was an effect both ways. Gary Gygax would have been the first to say that the game of Dungeons & Dragons was certainly influenced by what he had read from Howard to Tolkien and everyone in between. And there's a natural offshoot there. And the question, I guess, becomes one that for later sword and sorcery or heroic fantasy fiction is, did the people who got involved at the Dungeons & Dragons level have an effect on that, one way or the other? And I guess when we talk about this, and I've had this conversation with Dave in the past, has been, did people who might have otherwise been immersed in the heroic fiction as readers, or potentially even as authors, find themselves sublimated a little bit by being more involved in role-playing games at the time, in that area, certainly Dungeons & Dragons, or maybe even on a more current basis, online via the internet with some of the massively multiplayer online games that are out there, such as World of Warcraft. So I guess my long answer to the question is, yes, certainly there was an influence, and if we want to talk about that a little more in detail, we can, but that's the perspective that I can bring to the discussion.